Okay, thank you for the
I
brief presentation.
I just want to try to clarify one point. Since the removal of El Toro production and the Exxon production, California refineries have been producing the same amount of gallons of gasoline than they were prior to those incidents. Is that correct?
I think it's, if we go that chart, so this chart is gasoline production, California gasoline production, as you see in the very far right hand, the last most current weeks, certainly within the middle of that band and even a bit above. So I'd characterize that as normal gasoline production, even though 17.6% of your crude oil processing capacity is offline. They're doing that by drawing the inventories down more aggressively and blending and creating that gasoline without processing crude oil. So that's how they do that. But as I point out, the inventories are all already quite low. And this is not only in California, but along the West Coast as a consequence of this.
You know, people have alternatives to fuel. One thing they don't have alternatives to is food. You always have to eat. And I compare this to food because food is also a very volatile market. If you have a drought, if you have a disease in a crop, a number of things could eliminate food from the supply, yet you don't see the drastic changes in the price in the food supply. When you do have a situation where there is a disease in a crop, the number of, let's say it happens to lemons, the number of lemons in the market is actually reduced. That's why the price of lemons goes up, because the actual amount of units is reduced and more people are competing to purchase that product. In gasoline, I haven't seen a reduction in the production of gasoline. I've only seen a shift in terms of who is producing more, who's producing less, and within the industry, let's say Exxon, because of their challenges at their refinery, is now buying from another refiner at a higher price, albeit, but if the refiner is succeeding in producing more gas and they're making a substantial profit from selling at a higher price to, let's say, Exxon, why would they go to their pumps or to their suppliers and charge them a higher price if they're actually making a bigger profit and still meeting their obligations to supply their buyers? And on another column, they're making a big profit in selling to a new buyer, which would be in this case Exxon. That's what if you go back to that profit column, that's what I'm having a hard time understanding. That if you see on the one hand, you know, the profit column is at about a 32 cents of every unit, then it spikes up to 117 and 89. That only demonstrates that selling the same amount of fuel, they're making more money, and it's not a product of a shortage. We don't have a fuel shortage in California. We simply have a shift in who is supplying the fuel. And would there be a way in the future, because you know we regulate the insurance company here in California in a way that requires a commissioner and requires an independent agency and price setting process. I mean, the insurance companies are looked after by the state very thoroughly in terms of trying to protect consumers. Yet, in a product like gasoline that is essential to every part of our economy, I mean, we have built out an amazing network of roads that all all transport vehicles fueled by gasoline. And in our farms, our food production is tied to gasoline. And in almost every level, we use petroleum fuels to power our economy. You'd think we take more of an interest in ensuring that the consumers are protected at every level. So can you add anything to my comments? I mean, do you have any reactions to what I said, or is there something that you can propose as to whether I'm incorrect, whether we do need to look at how we can minimize these huge increases, these overnight increases that are unjustified.
Well, I think, I guess part of the clarification is that I think all the refineries from that large increase in that dark red bar are certainly making a lot more money than they did just a couple of months earlier, with the exception of 2 facilities. ExxonMobil and Tesoro Golden Eagle, that's basically, they're paying cost to cover their obligations. But clear, so.
By their own devices, because of their own problems that they've created for themselves, either a limitation in their refinery output or a labor dispute that they can't handle.
And so I think, but you're absolutely right. All the other refineries are making a lot more revenue, and their costs really haven't changed over that very short period of time. So that's their incentive to not have one of those problems.
But why don't prices go up at the gas stations that are supplied by Exxon or El Toro? Why do they have to go up equally at every single gas station? If I'm a shoe producer and my costs go up, well, in my store, my shoes are going to cost more. Why do they have to go up in my competitor's store as well? This is where I'm trying to figure out whether the consumers actually have a choice in California. Do we give them a choice to shop at those outlets that can really bring the prices down? Does that begs the question, do we have a gas monopoly in California that's based on 5 refiners that are engaging in some kind of collusion?
So there's 11 facilities producing California fuel. We encourage consumers to always look around for prices to the best price. The level and the quality of gasoline is very, very high in California because of the standards. The gasoline, regardless of who produces it, is very low in sulfur, aromatics, benzene. So it's a good quality gasoline, not like back in the early 80s or early 90s. So I think what happens is prices rise at the wholesale level, and they will rise for everyone because everyone's charging more. Now, what can happen at distribution terminals, if your price is very low, you will have a lot of additional customers if you're selling non-contracted volumes of gasoline. But most of the gasoline sold is under supply contracts. Most of the service stations are owned by a business person. It's their franchisee. They have a supply contract, and so they don't have a choice of where they're going to shop around. They see a higher price. They usually pass it on very quickly. The reason they do that, if you're receiving 8,000 gallons, and it's 20 cents a gallon higher than it was a couple of days ago, you have to pass those costs along immediately at the pump because you're only making about $100 a day as an average service station operator in California. So that's why these prices go up rather quickly.
I understand that concept. For the small sellers, they don't have a choice. They buy it from the market, wholesale market. They make a small profit. But when you see these big profit shifts going to the primary producers, contributing to the overall market price, I see a problem. I see an unfair situation. And we'll continue with our panel and probably root out some of those questions. I want to thank you for your participation and for being here today and for your testimony. We're gonna move on to the next panel. Thank you very much. For our next panel, we will discuss the state's gasoline market and the prices from each of their perspectives. The panel will include Jamie Court, the president of Consumer Watchdog, Philip K. Berliger, the economist and consultant to Western States Petroleum Association, Jay McKeeman, vice president of the California Independent Oil Marketers Association, and Kathleen Foote, senior assistant attorney general and antitrust chief in the attorney general's office. If we can begin our discussion or our presentation by Jamie Court. the president of Consumer Watchdog. Jamie, how are you? Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really gratified to be here. I haven't seen a discussion like this in 15 years on gas prices. That was when I got tapped to learn a little bit about him by Antonio Villaraigosa when he was the Speaker of the Assembly. And there was the first gas price spikes of our modern times in 1999, and he created this task force under the auspices of the Attorney General, Bill Lockyer. And so I've learned and observed a little bit about the gasoline market, though we've obviously been involved in other areas, primarily over the many 15 years. And I just want to give you a little bit of sitting through maybe 40 hours of meetings, what I learned and what I've observed over the last 15 years, which is things haven't changed very much since that task force. This is a chart from the EIA, the Energy Information Administration. We have copies of our report and our copies of our presentation. But what we see in California is consistently high over the last 10 years, according to this chart, prices. The gap between national average and California average over 10 years historically is 32 cents. And that includes in the national average number by EIA, the California gas price. So it's actually a much larger gap. It's a very, very big gap. And today the gap is 84 cents. So it gets bigger. The things that concerned us primarily with this task force, and the things that should concern you and obviously are the spikes, the peaks there. Because when that gas price gets really far, like 84 cents, 94 cents, these price spikes are producing unbelievable circumstances. If we go to the next slide. This is the February price spike. Californians spent an extra $550 million in February on their gasoline. And if you look here, we're charting here on the left the price of crude oil, which you see falling, and that's the red line, and the blue line is the price of regular gasoline, carb gasoline in California. And you'll see how as crude falls, we still see the price go up. It's obviously precipitated by the shutdown of the Tesoro refinery initially, and later, 16 days later, the Exxon Torrance refinery explosion. Now, when we saw on February 2nd the Tesoro refinery go down, the executive Tesoro, CEO of Tesoro told investors he could have, even with that strike that he said was imminent, he told investors we can keep that plant running because you don't need, you could use contract workers, you could use managers, we could have kept that plant running. And yet we see the impact of that shutdown to 8% of the gas supply when that refinery explosion hits. It just goes up like a rocket, like a Houston rocket. And I'll tell you, when we start to look at why that Tesoro refinery went down, really, we don't know. When we look at whether that Exxon Torrance refinery was continuing to run during the crisis immediately after at full speed, half speed, we don't know. California Energy Commission may know, but the public doesn't know. I don't know. I do know this, that $550 million is the total for that month, and if you take away the 15 cents extra that California pays in higher taxes than the national average, we're still, by the way, at $400 million, just short of $400 million after taxes that the oil industry has retained and made. And as your report for the committee says, that all goes to the oil refiners. This is a profit for the oil refiners of $400 million for a dollar price spike in the month of February. The difference nationally for the entire period of 10 years of that 32 cents per gallon, which I think is a conservative estimate, it's $47.5 billion more we've paid in California over 10 years. If you take away the taxes, the 15 cents extra a gallon per taxes, so after tax, that costs consumers about $24 billion over 10 years, California consumers. That's how much extra we have paid for our gasoline because of the forces you've heard today. Go to the next slide. The forces we identified in 1999. This is the most thorough investigation I know of, sanctioned by this committee, of gas prices in the state, and there hasn't been one since. But we found very clearly, after listening to many presentations like the one you just heard, which had a lot of numbers from the industry and not the industry, I believe Phil Vertigler was there. Yes, he was. Nice seeing you. That's right. He taught me everything I know, but he works for the oil company, so you got to be careful. I distilled my knowledge to what was important, let's put it that way. The supply disruption, and so everybody came to this conclusion.
I think the word is you refined your knowledge.
Right, Very good. So supply disruptions that contributed to these price spikes were because refiners have little spare capacity to cover outages, refiners maintain relatively low levels of inventory, refiners have significant market control, and we have a problem with carb gas being something that can't be made elsewhere and import. So these same factors are controlled today. If you go to today's market, you will see two refiners, Tesoro and Chevron, control 56% of the market. So if I do not believe, and we'll find out, I imagine at some point from the annual reports, I don't believe that Tesoro is really not going to make a killing off the closure of its Martinez refinery. I really don't believe that. But we'll see. And I don't believe that Exxon's going to be hurting its downstream revenue either. What this consolidation does is a lot of things, but most importantly, it keeps us running on empty and short supplies. We're not making enough to have an ample supply to cover when these refineries go down. What happens is the commodities market is what's spiking this price of gasoline. If there's no real shortage, there is at least a perceived shortage. The price of gas goes up, and it goes up very precipitously. And when we ran into a few of these problems since 1999, I want to just give you an example of what, it's not just, by the way, there's many issues, many angles to this. We're just looking at refiners today, but there's also the disappearance of independent gas stations. There's a proliferation of branded gas stations. So, I mean, Exxon may have contracts with its own gas stations, but Exxon controls much of what happens at those stations. I don't think we can go into that too much today. But the point being, refiners don't have an interest in making more gasoline or having higher inventories. So we have a situation like happened in 2004 when Shell wanted to close its Bakersfield refinery. And we said, wait a second, we're experiencing high gas prices. You're going to take 2% of the gasoline and 6% of the diesel offline. Why? And they said, we're not making money. And a whistleblower came to us, and with the help of the Attorney General, and I believe Kathleen Foote was there at the time, with the help of Senator Barbara Boxer, there was a big investigation. Shell was required or voluntarily agreed to find a buyer with the help of the Attorney General, getting them a broker, find a fair price, because we found out it was a very profitable refiner. And none of these other refiners you're looking at now wanted to buy the Shell refinery. It was Flying J, which was a truck stop, which tells you what happens when you have a consolidated market. This is an apples to apples comparison of days of gas supply. This is all data from the Energy Information Administration. And what we've done is look at days of supply in refineries and terminals nationwide and refineries and terminals in California. And we've taken consumption data nationwide from the EIA, and we've taken consumption data from the Board of Equalization. If you look in the presentation from the Energy Commission, they publish very different numbers. They publish only not refinery and terminal, bulk terminal data, which could be compared to the EIA. So we're looking at apples and apples here, and what we find is if you look at refinery and bulk terminals, the U.S. for 10 years has an average of 18.7 days on hand. This is all of the U.S. This is averaging those huge inventories in the Gulf with the little inventories in some parts of the East Coast. California, the island that can import gas easily from wherever else, we have 10.7 days. We have a week less of refined supply on hand. A week less of refined supply on hand. And that is what's causing the problem, because you can look at gas prices as they rise. It's obviously as supplies drop or inventories drop. Now, we can't stop the refinery outages. We can't stop a refinery fire, but we can have an ample cushion of the type of gasoline we need in this state to make up the difference so the commodities market doesn't go nuts when the gasoline when it perceives that gasoline is in short supply. Hope I've said that correctly. These are the price spikes over the last decade. We found they're often precipitated by refinery problems. These are just various refinery problems. This system is made to break. The oil company's keeping it running on empty. And when it breaks, you see a price spike. And the price spike, as we have just noted from the commission, as your report notes to this committee, is all profit for the refiners involved. They have every incentive to want to create a price spike like this because their crude oil contracts are consistent, their taxes are consistent, and when the prices go up, refiners make a lot of money. Does that sound familiar to you? It sounds not like Sandy. a market that was struck by Sandy, it sounds like a market that was struck by Enron. And the similarities to the energy market in California are very real. I was there, and I feel that way. And I heard many explanations at the time in this building and outside of this building for the energy supply, not in the Senate, of course, because John Burton ran the Senate back then. But it sounded a lot like some of the explanations I've heard today, and I'm sure I'm going to hear pretty soon. The reality is, we don't know, I don't know, Consumer Watchdog knows, the public doesn't know, you don't know what actual real-time inventories are. Current days of supply in the state are not publicly available. I'm taking the commission's word that it knows, and it's just not able to tell us. But I can tell you we have very little transparency because we have 3 months lagging on days of supply in the state. We know gas prices every week from the EIA, but there's a huge lag on inventories. And I think since there is no agency publicly disclosing that or publicly disclosing information on outages and maintenance at refineries in real time, that's what's keeping us blind to what's really happening. And I believe there are many state agencies that knew about what was going on with electricity trading, and that didn't seem to prevent it back in 2001. We need public transparency about refinery outages, refinery capacity, when refineries are running, when there's supply on hand. Next one is a slide that says everything about how this is like a Houston rocket rather than any other type of rocket, and how this is a lot more like Enron than it is Sandy. You'll see that except for the period right after the recession, 2007-8, 2008, 2010, when things hit really badly, as the price of gas goes up, so do downstream. That means refining, transportation, not crude production, but downstream margins, downstream profits for Chevron, which is the largest refiner in the state. And you'll also see at the end of the year, that red line is quarterly gas prices. This was before our price spike. You saw how quarterly gas prices went down? The blue line is refining margins for Chevron. They were going up. And what happened, we don't know because we don't have the data, but you can imagine that as the price of gas went up, those refining margins for Chevron, those first quarter margins are going to go up through the roof. I'll just leave you with this, that when we were exploring this market in 99 and 2000 and came up with that report, we were privy to a bunch of internal memos, and Senator Ron Wyden made some of these public. But this is what happened in the early to mid-90s. All of the major oil companies have had memos similar to this. This is a memo from Chevron, our largest refiner in the state. And it says that an senior energy analyst at a recent API convention, this is the American Petroleum Institute, said, if the petroleum industry doesn't reduce its refining capacity, it will never see any substantial profits, any increase in refining margins, profits. In the last 9 months, gasoline demand has been healthy and inventories remain close to record low levels, factors that should normally lead to higher prices. However, refining utilization has been rising, sustaining high levels of operations, thereby keeping prices low. All of this boils down to one thing. Oil refiners in this state want to keep inventories low, supplies low, refining capacities low so they can keep prices high. They don't compete to make more gasoline to undercut the other's price. They work together to keep refining capacity limited so prices can be as high as possible. And that's why we have California paying, even after taxes, $24 billion more than the rest of the nation over the last 10 years. My conclusion is simple, having watched this play out. California needs to collect and publicly disclose real-time data about refinery operations and days of supply on hand. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to get an accurate figure on days of supply on hand, because the EIA does keep refinery and terminal data, bulk terminal data, and they don't keep the same sets of data that the California Energy Commission keeps and publishes. And so to do this calculation, we had to get California-specific data on the refineries and bulk terminals, and we got then the national average for refineries and bulk terminals, and that's national, including California. So we can tell you there's a weak spread between inventories calculated that way in America and in California, and we believe California should mandate that refiners keep what is the equivalent of 8 days of supply measured, 18 days of supply measured that way of gasoline on hand. That may not be the right number. The point is, we should keep an ample supply on hand so that when a refinery or two break down, which is typically a pattern, prices don't go up $1 in a month. Right now, we don't have that. I don't believe that we have a very good, transparent system that lets us tell us what that number is. Based on our number, we can say pretty confidently that in bulk terminals and refineries, there's a weak difference in supply between us and the national average. We think that's got to change, and we hope you'll help us change it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Court. Next, we'll hear from Jay McKeeman. He is the Vice President of the California Independent Oil Marketers Association. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Can you switch on your mic there if you just can press the button there? There we go.
You want to move? You can help him if he wants. He's with the retailers.
Sure.
If not,
All right. Got it?
yeah, hand it to me.
Let me try, make sure. Okay, good. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting us to this important hearing. I'm Jay McKeeman. I'm with the California Independent Oil Marketers Association. And before I jump into my presentation, I would just like to commend the Energy Commission. We have a jewel. We have a very unusual and highly qualified resource in the California Energy Commission and their ability to understand market forces and gasoline and diesel flow and refinery conditions in this state. So if there's anything that I would suggest right off the bat is make sure to keep funding for that agency and that part of their activity, because it's of huge benefit to California. California Independent Oil Marketers, who are we? And it's kind of hard to read, but towards the middle of the slide, there's bulk tanks. Basically, we're everything to the right of bulk tanks. So our job, simply stated, is that we attempt to get product from the fuel manufacturers and importers to the consumer. And that can happen either through pipeline transactions, but it's mostly done by truck in this state. And that's who we are. We're typically small, independently owned, family-owned businesses in the state. Average employment's around 25 to 30 employees. We have some larger companies, but for the bulk of the activities in the state, we're definitely small businesses. But we do a big job for small businesses. We transport about 14.5 billion gallons of gasoline and about 3.5 billion gallons of diesel and untold millions of gallons of lubricants throughout this state. We try to do that safely, effectively, and get the best price to the consumer that we can. We are price takers. So we take the price set by the refiners or the importers, the wholesale price, add margin to that, and pass it along, as are the retailers. They take the wholesale price delivered from our wholesalers and then add their own margin on top of that. But the margins are very small, typically 10 to 15 cents a gallon. That's at very good margins. Pennies, we measure margins in pennies, not dollars. So what happened from our perspective? We had refinery problems. We had to switch over to summer fuel. And I'm going to disagree a little bit with Gordon's assessment about the fuel under the cap inclusion. If you look at fuel prices as of January 1st, between January 1st and through the middle or later part of January, you would expect to see 10 cents a gallon increase, because that's basically what the fuels under the cap assessment is on gasoline. You don't see it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that margins were pretty thick right then, and there was ability for wholesalers, retailers, and the producers to absorb some of that assessment, that 10 cents, 13 cents a gallon for diesel into their margins. But I think what happened in the price spike is that full inclusion of the fuels under the cap assessment got included into the price, and that might be just a booster effect on what happened with the cap.